Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inquirer Live at Gameday Central, Phillies home opener. Today, we're coming to you live from the press box at Citizens Bank Park, where the Phillies will face off against the Atlanta Braves in a few moments here. I'm Alex Coffey, Phillies reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm joined by my fellow Phillies writer and MLB reporter, Scott Lauber.
Hey, Alex, how are you?
Good. For our audience watching at home, head over to inquirer.com/Phillies Game Day to follow along with us as we live tweet throughout the game, post game related content, and answer your comments and questions live during this segment. Okay, let's get into it. So I think heading off of last season, it's not an exaggeration to say that the stakes are very high for the Phillies this season. Last year's playoff run ended abruptly and well short of expectations, and this team came into spring training feeling hungry. But it's one thing to feel that way and another to act on it. So how did the Phillies reach their championship aspirations? I have a few ideas, Scott, but I'd love to hear yours first.
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember a year where expectations were any higher than this. Maybe 2010, coming off the 2009 World Series with Roy Halladay on the mound for opening day. Maybe that was sort of the last time I recall, like World Series or bust, championship window and those kinds of conversations. And that's really where we are right now. We are squarely in what is a championship window for the Phillies. They went to the World Series in 2022. They went to Game 7 of the NLCS last year. And so, look, the owner said it himself on day one, first full squad workout when he talked to the team. He said, I want my trophy back. It's World Series or bust, essentially, is what he said. And that's really what we're looking at here on day one. And there's pressure that's associated with that. But I think mostly players I talked to through spring training, we're looking forward to that challenge and looking forward to that, to those expectations and kind of embracing them.
So what do you see as like some of the tangible on-field things that have to happen in order for them to reach those aspirations?
There's so much, right? Because you know how long the season is. It's 162 games. It's 6 months. So you've got to have good health. I think it starts with good health. Were the Phillies to lose Zach Wheeler or Aaron Nola in particular for any length of time, they'd be in big trouble because they're their two best pitchers. So you've got to start with good health. You need a little luck, which I suppose kind of equates to good health. But you also need for certain players to perform to the level that you're expecting. And if one guy were to have a down year, you have another guy that needs to overachieve. So there's just so much that goes into it over the course of time. It's not like the NFL where it's sort of a sprint from the get-go. If I were to tell you that they started 25-32, you'd say, well, that's not great, but it's not curtains for them either because they started 25-32 last year and made the playoffs. So a lot of things have to go right, but I'd say number one, first and foremost, is health.
Yeah, I don't think that, coming off to a better start this season is necessarily the end all be all, but I do think it would be very helpful for it not to be a sprint to the finish every year as it has been in the past 2 seasons. So I definitely think that, getting off to a strong start would be better for them. And the schedule that they have over the next few weeks, I think, sets them up in a position to do that. They're playing, a few teams that they should be winning series against. So that seems feasible. And then the other thing that I've got my eye on is chase rate. Just like, obviously that was a theme during the NLCS, but just getting those numbers down, even for some of the more veteran guys. And, you're not going to change them. They're aggressive hitters, and that's what's made them successful. But, even if you can, just lower the chase rate by a couple percentage points, I think that would be meaningful. So, that's something that I know that they've been working on all spring and something that I'm going to keep an eye on, that I think could make a big impact over the course of the season. So, all right.
I think to go with that, right? So
Yeah.
you talk about all of those things. And I think one thing that's important to note is that it's the same roster pretty much from last year. All the characters are the same. People are going to be very, very familiar with this team because they've known them. So I think what really it comes down to are marginal improvements. And I think that's what you're talking about. Marginal improvements in terms of chase rate, marginal improvements in terms of defense, right? How much better can the defense be with Yohan Rojas in center field full time rather than having to have Kyle Schwarber play left field full time? So marginal upgrades in a lot of different areas is how you go from 90 wins to say 92, 93, 94. And I think that's really what we're looking at this year, are getting a little bit better in a lot of different areas, and it all adds up to a big difference in the end.
Definitely, definitely. And they've obviously, they didn't do a lot this offseason, so they've bought into this roster. So they have confidence in the roster, and now it's just about making the most of it. Speaking of the roster, let's pivot to some specific questions. Like I said, there wasn't a lot of overturn last year, with the exception of Spencer Turnbull and Whit Merrifield, but that doesn't mean that there aren't questions leading into this year. The two guys that I have my eye on personally are Yohan Ross and Taiwan Walker. Obviously, Walker's on the injured list right now with an impingement in his right shoulder, I believe. So I'm just curious when he comes back to see where his velocity is at, if what we saw earlier in the spring, like lower velocity, was due to the injuries, or if it was more due to, you know, just like a carry on from last season when he struggled with his velocity. So I'm just kind of curious to get answers on that. And then the Rojas question is obvious. Like, can he hold his own at the plate? Can he get his chase rate down? Maintain his mechanics throughout the games, like big league games, rather than just in BP. So those are the two guys that I'm going to be focusing on. But what about you, Scott? Who do you have your eye on?
Do you find it as funny as I do that I'm sure you get the emails too, right? People who are like, why haven't they done anything this offseason? It's so frustrating. Well, they did sign Aaron Nola to a $172 million contract,
that's
which
true.
is the third largest contract that was signed this offseason. It just so happens he was their guy. And, it strikes me today of all days, with the Braves in town for opening day, like, how much different would it have been if Aaron Nola signed with the Braves, right? Because they came at him hard when free agency started, really hard. The Braves, if the Braves had signed Nola, that's a game changer in terms of this rivalry and this division. So, like, we can't sleep on that, right? They signed him to a 7-year, $172 million deal, and he was a free agent. He could have gone anywhere, including the Braves, and so that's not nothing. So they brought him back, and then they did extend Zach Wheeler, which means he will not be on the free agent market after this season. He's theirs through 2027. So, look, those were two huge things, and I think when you win 90 games and you get to the NLCS Game 7, and you should have won the NLCS and gotten to the World Series for a second year in a row, you don't have to do a whole lot other than keep your guys. And so within that group of guys, I think, Rojas is certainly the one, right? We talked about him all spring long. Felt like you or I were writing a story about him every single day. And, it was justified because he was the storyline in spring training. Would he win the center field job? How did he look at the plate? Is he making the changes they want to see him make? It's really interesting to sort of break down what they're trying to get him to do. I know you've had conversations with Kevin Long, the hitting coach. Kevin Long broke it down for me in a very simplistic way. He said, look, young guy with a lot of speed like Rojas wants to use his hands, and he wants to throw his hands at the ball, make contact, and then run. And he goes, I was around it with Brett Gardner. We saw it with other hitters over the years. You need to get them to let them use their legs in their swing and have the legs and the hands catch up to one another. And I think that was a lot of what spring training was about. And if they had turned around at the end of spring and said, hey, Rojas is hitting 130 in spring training, we're not going to put him on the team. Like they told him, don't worry about the results. Just implement the changes we're trying to get you to implement. And if they had said, the performance is not there, you're not making the team, it kind of would have been, number one, disingenuous. And number two, I think kind of crushing for him. So he's on the team, and we're going to look and see. There's going to be definitely a spotlight on him. He can't be a total zero in the number 9 hole, but he also doesn't have to be great. The average number 9 hitter in baseball last year hit 230 with like a 660 OPS. If he can do that, if he can meet that threshold, he'll be just fine because he's such a plus defender that's important. So, I look at a guy like him. I look at somebody like Brandon Marsh, who I think, it's a big year for him to kind of, does he go from being an everyday or a platoon player who plays mostly against righties to being an everyday guy? Does Bryson Stott, emerge as a 300 hitter and a potential all-star, which I think he can be? I think this is what I'm talking about when I talk about young players, and can they, I don't know if you want to say overachieve, but can they continue to build on what they've already done? And it can make the difference between the wild card and winning the division.
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting talking to a few people on the team about how they evaluated Rojas's spring. There was a big emphasis on not just looking at his hits or his batting average or whatever it might be, his line, his surface level numbers, and looking at what he did in BP and what he did in the cage. And Kevin Long is convinced that once what he saw in those areas translates into big league games, that the result is going to be electric, in his words. So I'm just curious to see, if that happens, when it happens, what it looks like. Easier said than done when the bright lights are on a young player like that. But
yeah, and how he handles struggle too, right? Like
yeah,
I think you and I have both gotten to know him now well enough. He's a pretty happy-go-lucky kid, right? Like
mm-hmm.
it's rare to kind of be around him without him being like having a smile on his face or
Mm-hmm.
being in a good mood or a positive mood. And if he's, doesn't have a hit for a week, how is that? Does that weigh on him? Does he feel the pressure of that? So I think they're looking for a lot of that too. I'm
Yeah.
curious what you think. The other player that I've got kind of circled on my roster, so to speak, is Christopher Sanchez. And I'm curious what you think about that, because a year ago this time, he wasn't even on our radar, and he was barely, to be honest, on the Phillies' radar. I don't think he was healthy. He went to AAA. He walked really all of AAA. He could not throw strikes. And then he comes and becomes kind of a savior of sorts for them through the middle of the season. And they were at the point where they're counting on him as a regular member of their rotation. They didn't go and sign Jordan Montgomery because they have Christopher Sanchez.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to see what that looks like over the course of a season now.
Yeah, I am too, especially because when he really started focusing on his control and getting the walk rate down, they dialed some of the velocity back, and he put strength on this offseason, and now it looks like, the velocity is ticking up again. So he can kind of marry those two things, the low walk rate and the velocity, which I think would be a really lethal combination for him, assuming that like his control he doesn't lose his control once he starts throwing harder. But yeah, obviously it's been remarkable, the transition, from going a guy that was like, kind of a quad A, shuffled from the big league team to the AAA team, to a mainstay in the rotation, has, super impressive, and obviously a credit to his work ethic.
So one thing that he said after one of his last starts, I think it might have been his last start down in Florida, he talked about how the spin, so he's adding a cutter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the spin from the new cutter was sort of bleeding into his changeup a little bit. His changeup's a big pitch for him. He might have one of the best changeups in baseball. So you hear that and you think, okay, work in progress, right? He's trying to add this cutter, but if the cutter is impacting the changeup and you don't want the changeup to spin the way that way, then are these things going to be in conflict with one another? Is the increased velocity going to be in conflict with the improved command? So he's still very much kind of like figuring his way as a starting pitcher. And will they, like you say, dial back the velocity if the command suffers? Will they shelve the cutter if the changeup suffers? Or will all of these things kind of come together for him? And if they do, he's 27. Maybe he's a lot more than a number 5 starter, but it's a big if. Again, if they all come together and if all of those things marry up, as you said, so I'm curious to see how that happens and how that goes. And then the pitching depth that's behind that. And I think that was a topic we talked about a lot going into spring training. Did they have enough pitching depth? The answer clearly was no, because they signed Colby Allard late, and they signed Spencer Turnbull like on Super Bowl Sunday, like 2 days before they all got there. So clearly they were like, we need more pitching depth. They've built some of that, but they're already dealing with an injury with with Taijuan Walker, excuse me. I have Suarez on the brain from last year. Walker is this year's Suarez. If somebody else were to go down, then they would be kind of in a bind. And then how much do you trust what's behind the starting 5 or starting 6, including Turnbull? How quickly will we see the Colby Allards, the Max Castillos, the Tyler Phillipses, the Mick Abels? And we know they're going to have to tap into some of them, but we don't know how many, and we don't know how soon.
Yeah, it's a difficult predicament to be in. I mean, you don't want to rush a prospect to the big leagues just for the sake of filling a spot, you mess with his development and put him in a situation that he doesn't feel like he's ready for. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Mick, but just in general, it would be difficult for them to do that. So, aside from Castillo and Allard, it doesn't really seem like they have a ton of options, but I guess they'll just pray that that they don't have any more injuries and that Turnbull can get the job done. And It's ironic. I was talking to him earlier today, and we were just discussing how, he went into this season really, you know, kind of bringing in a different mindset. Like, I need to be in the bullpen to make this team, and I need to learn how to get ready quickly and be on call. And it's just a different animal for a guy that's been starting throughout his college and throughout his minor league career, and now he finds himself back in the rotation again, which is obviously something that he has a lot of experience in. So I know that from his perspective, it worked out for the best. So we'll see if it works out for the best for the Phillies too.
Yeah, and look, to be fair, right? It's not a Phillies problem. I mean, we're looking at
Yeah.
this from a Phillies lens, but there are 30 teams in baseball who are on opening day wondering, do we have enough pitching? And what happens when the first guy goes down? And what happens when the next guy goes down? That next man up mentality. Like, I was just over on the Braves side, and it really kind of hits home when you're in that clubhouse and I was talking to Austin Riley and Brian Snitker, and it really hits home that that's a team that has won 6 straight divisions. They're every bit as much World Series or bust, win now, championship window as the Phillies are. And yet every fifth day and every fourth and fifth day, they're going to roll out Chris Sale and Charlie Morton, who are like 38 and 40 or something like that years old, or however old Sale is. I know Morton's 40. And Sale hasn't pitched a lot the last few years. And, how much of the season will they be able to get through? Is there going to be a period of time in the summer where the Braves have to shut one of them down just to keep them healthy for October? And so they're going to tap into their pitching depth as well. And the Dodgers, like last year, the Dodgers lost just about everyone in their rotation, and they survived and won 100 games because they had the depth behind them. So it's certainly a situation, I think, where everyone's in that boat. Everyone's wondering how much their depth is going to be tested, and the Phillies are no different. So while they've insulated themselves for sure from the start of spring training to now with Allard and with Castillo and they love Tyler Phillips. I don't know how many times they mentioned him unprompted throughout spring training about how much they like him. He's from the area. He's from South Jersey and might get a chance to pitch here during the season. So they know they're going to tap into that, just like every other team knows the same thing.
Yeah, I'm surprised that the Mets didn't serve as a cautionary tale with the older guys last year, with Scherzer and Verlander. Obviously, that didn't work out too well for them. Not to say that they're the same pitchers, but like
you make a really good point. You make a really good point, and Morton is theirs. They know Morton, and they've known him for a long time, and they know, I think, probably, but Sale is the huge question mark there, and it goes back to what we were talking about almost at the top, right? Like, the Phillies re-signed Aaron Nola. The Braves did not sign Aaron Nola, and think about how different it would be and think about how different the offseason would have gone if the Braves had come out of the chute, signed Nola, and now they've got Strider, Fried, and Nola 1, 2, 3, and the Phillies are scrambling to find even a number 2, right, to go behind Zach Wheeler. So it was really, to me, kind of a pivot point in the offseason, and I wonder whether it was a pivot point in general in this rivalry, so to speak. I mean, it's been rattling around my head. I wrote this story that's on the Inquirer website today. Like, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, who's chasing who? And it's kind of a silly question to ask. Like, I almost had to apologize to Austin Riley for asking, because they've won 6 straight division titles, right? And I was like, Austin, I'm sorry to ask you this, but do you feel like they're chasing you, or are you chasing them? And he was a good sport about it, and he knew kind of where I was going. And he said, like, frankly, if you're talking about the division, they're still chasing us. I know the postseason hasn't gone the Braves' way the last 2 years, and they want to reverse that. But you have to win the division first, or you have to make the playoffs first, I should say. And so they still feel like they're the ones who are in the pace car, who are in the lead here. But it's closer than 14 games in the standings the last 2 years, and I do wonder whether the Phillies keeping Nola, forcing the Braves to then look in another direction for rotation help, and settling on a trade for Chris Sale. Chris Sale was a great pitcher. I covered him with the Red Sox. He was the ace of aces. He was sort of the way we think of Zach Wheeler right now. That's what Chris Sale was for them back in 17 and 18. But he's had a lot of injuries. There's some age there now. It's a question for the Braves, no doubt about it.
Let's move on to a few predictions for some of the probably top performers, assuming that they're top performers this season. So I have 2. Our colleague David Murphy recently wrote that Alec Boehm could be poised for a big power surge, maybe this year, maybe in the coming years. And I think I buy into that personally. It seems like his power numbers have been steadily increasing season by season. So, as far as home runs go, I think he said he predicts 30 at some point. I don't think he's there yet. So, I think maybe 25 would be my prediction. And then the second one that I have my eye on is Zach Wheeler winning a Cy Young. Obviously, he's come close in previous years, but it seems like he's just really locked in. I was looking through his spring game logs from previous seasons, and he's been more of a slow starter in previous years. So it was, obviously take spring starts with a grain of salt, but he just seems like he's kind of unlocked a different gear, and obviously he's got the splitter now, which will be a weapon against left-handed batters. So those are the two predictions that I have going into the season. What do you have, Scott?
Yeah, does it make you nervous that Wheeler was so good in spring training? It was like,
Yeah.
leave some of that down, leave some of that,
Yeah.
have a clunker for a change. You'd rather have a clunker down there than you would up here. So, no, I agree. I think Wheeler is probably this, believe it or not, I think he's the Cy Young favorite. At least for me, he is. I'll go in a few other directions. I think, as I mentioned, Brandon Marsh, I think it's a big year for him. We're going to know a lot more about his future, whether he's an everyday player or a platoon guy. Jason Worth was a name that was brought up to me in relation to Marsh in spring training, and somebody reminded me that when Worth joined the Phillies in 2007, he was a platoon guy. In that case, it was because he'd been hurt a lot early in his career, but he played mostly against lefties. They got Jeff Jenkins to play against righties in 2008, and then in 2009, he gets a chance. Worth gets a chance to play every day, and he hits 36 homers, makes the All-Star team. I don't know if Marsh's ceiling is that high, but it's higher than what we've seen from him so far. And I thought he made a lot of strides last year, positively. So I'm curious to see what we get or what we see from him throughout the course of the season. But I'll give you another one. I think. Look, how long are we into this? I can't believe, and we haven't mentioned the name Bryce Harper. Can you believe that? I think he's going to have a huge year. I think playing first base is going to help him. I think he's actually really good over there at first base. And I think he could potentially have another MVP type year. He would be only the fifth player to win an MVP at two different positions. So that would put him in kind of rarefied air. I think he's going to have a big year. And I think he'll be in the MVP conversation when all's said and done.
It's a far-fetched prediction to make. All right, so how do you think that this season is? I think last thing in the prediction front, how do you think the season is going to play out? And take it with a grain of salt, as always. Predictions are, we are not. This is not Karnak like type thing. We don't know what's going to happen. But how do you see this season if you had to predict? Like,
oh, okay. So you're going to make me go first on this one.
Yeah.
So look, I think that they are, as I said, I think that they are a lot closer to the Braves than the standings have shown the last 2 years. I think that they kind of buried themselves, right, by Memorial Day each of the last 2 years, and we're looking at the wild card. And when we think back to last year, they won the wild card fairly easily. Like 2 years ago, right, it went down to that last weekend of the season. They played really, really poorly in Chicago. It was like, are they going to blow this again? They clinched it third to last game. Last year, there was a lot more breathing room than that. So I think that they're comfortably a playoff team for me. We'll start there. So I think that they are in the mix to be among the top three teams in the National League. I think mostly people look at the Dodgers and the Braves and perceive them as superpower teams, and they are. I think the Phillies probably nationally are not looked at in that same category. I think that they are much closer to that category than they are given credit for. So I think they're firmly a playoff team. I'm not going to go crazy and go pick them to win the division because only a fool would pick against the Braves from April to September. It's their time of year, right? And I don't say that like as a negative thing, like they're a regular season team. I think the Braves still really, really care about winning the division, winning the regular season. I think it means a lot to them. They love to fly those divisional flags down at Truist Park in Atlanta. And so I think that they are still the favorite to win the division. I guess I'm answering my own question then. I think the Phillies are still chasing them. And I think that, I'd love to see them match up again in the playoffs. It's only happened once, I believe, that a team has beaten the same team 3 years in a row, the Yankees in 77 6-78, I think, beat the Royals 3 years in a row. I don't think it's happened other than that. So it would be great to see if they matched up again, if the Phillies could do it to them a third time. So I'm calling a wild card, and I'm calling like 92 wins. How about that?
Yeah, yeah. I agree that I don't think that they're a powerhouse to the level of some of these other teams, the Braves, the Dodgers, obviously. But I do think that once they reach October, it might sound like a cliche, but playing in this environment, I just think that something shifts, and they've kind of established this aura over the past 2 years, that they can kind of play free and loose, with the exception of the last few games of the NLCS, of course. But but I do think that this group is focused and hungry, and I think that there's this playing with house money aspect of entering the postseason that they feel, even if they sneak in via the wild card. So my prediction would be wild card, and then a return trip to the World Series, and them finishing the job. And if they do that, I fully expect fans to be on talk radio complaining that they didn't win the division the next day. So that is my prediction from beginning to finish.
They won the World Series, but they still haven't won the NL East.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
I mean, one other thing, I think, so I guess I didn't say how far they'd go. I guess I've got them in like the NLDS or NLCS. I mean, it's really hard to beat the same team 3 years in a row. So I don't know. But there's certainly, I don't think the Braves want to play them again in the postseason. I think the Braves would be perfectly happy being in the other side of the NL bracket and not having to deal with it. Trey Turner's described it as that they're a third deck team. Chicho Realmuto said that he looks at them as still a second half team. None of this is to say that they're going to like punt on the first 2 months and say like it doesn't matter what kind of start we get off to. I think it does matter to them. They talked about it a lot in spring training, but I do think that that there is a sense of like it's not the worst thing in the world, right? If like you don't come out on fire, I think that they feel like that they're really good, and I think that I think that maybe they wear a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, so to speak, that they're not grouped in with the Dodgers and the Braves all the time, and I think they're going to be really good, and I think they're going to make the playoffs, as I said, comfortably. At least as the wild card, and then push, take their chances again in the postseason, which is really what the postseason is. You kind of push all your chips in and see how far you can get.
Definitely. And I do think that chip on the shoulder type thing is important for them, because we saw what happened when they played the Diamondbacks, and all of a sudden they were expected to win. So I do think that they like being in that position. Well, it'll be interesting to see how the season plays out and whether our predictions are somewhat right or terribly wrong.
Probably terribly wrong.
Yeah. That's all we've got for today, everyone.
Clip and save.
Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in to Inquirer Live at Gameday Central. Be sure to stick around on inquirer.com/Phillies Game Day to follow along with us as we live tweet throughout the game, post game related news, and answer your comments and questions. Thank you so much, guys.